There's a big question facing a jury in Boston. Should a terrorist be executed or spend the rest of his life behind bars? Federal execution hasn't happened since 1999. Here's a look back.
The court order to execute inmate Timothy James McVeigh has been fulfilled. Pursuant to the sentence of the United States District Court in the District of Colorado, Timothy James McVeigh has been executed by lethal injection.
Allow me to correct myself. That took place in 2003. The announcement was made by the warden at a federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh died of lethal injection. McVeigh's act of domestic terrorism remains the worst in U.S. history. 168 people killed, over 600 injured, many of them children. He declined a final statement. Witnesses said that McVeigh looked them in the eye just before lying back to be executed. Today in Boston, defense attorneys for Tsarnaev made the case for sparing his life. Attorney David Bruck said Jahar was a good kid who was led down the path to terrorism by his fanatical older brother. Bruck told jurors that no punishment of Tsarnaev would equal the suffering of the bombing victim, saying there is no point in trying to hurt him as he hurt because it can't be done. Two guests join me for a closer look at the choice facing the Tsarnaev jury. Attorney Michael Coyne, you recognize as the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law, and Evan Horowitz, you may not recognize, but we'd like you to. He reports for the Boston Globe, and he recently made a statistical study of federal death penalty cases. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much.
Steve. Michael, give us an update of this first day. The defense had kind of postponed their opening statements until today. What do we get from them?
Not much, actually. I was expecting a lot more of the background of the family dynamic, a lot more of the reasons why we should spare his life. And what I heard more in the defendant's opening today was that the jury should punish him severely as it possibly can. And the most severe punishment for this young man would be to spend the next 60 years of his life in prison without the benefit of release. That the death penalty really can't possibly equal the type of suffering that he visited on the families that were killed at the finish line as well as those he maimed.
So they're asking the jury to make this kind of, to untie the Gordian knot, as they say. Evan, you write an incredible article in the Globe, which is quite interesting because it takes a look at something that we don't really consider as much as we once did. In Massachusetts, one of the 18 states that don't have the death penalty. Even the federal government, which has how many, 6,000 people on death row, but they're not executing people at a great pace. Actually, 74 on death row, but they aren't executing at a great pace. Talk about that angle from
so one thing is, even if he does get the death penalty, he might still spend 60 years in prison. There's a long distance between being sentenced to death and actually being executed. It's 74 people since the death penalty was reinstated, the federal death penalty was reinstated. 74 people have been sentenced to death. That's going back to 1988. 3 of them have been executed. 3 of them out of 74. It's and none, as you say, since 2003.
And one of them being Timothy McVeigh, who's most notorious there. Talk about this element, which is fascinating to me in your article. A lot of people think, oh, well, do the death penalty and we're done with it. He's off the public dole. It's going to cost us less money. But in fact, quite the opposite is true.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There's a lot of sort of pragmatic support for the death penalty on the grounds that it'll save money. Why imprison someone for 60 years? You pay for it every year. You execute them, it'll be less expensive.
And it's over.
And it's over. But it doesn't work that way. It's actually much more expensive to execute someone than it is to keep them in prison for life. And that's not because the actual execution is expensive. It's not. It's not expensive to undertake a lethal injection and kill someone, but the trial's much more expensive. And the appeals process is much more expensive.
Michael, take us to that point. Sure. Let's say this jury decides, you know what, we think this guy is so guilty he ought to be put to death, but that didn't happen right away. What happens next?
The lawyers get more involved than they probably even now are involved in the case. Any death penalty case is going to go through a series of appeals. The first appeal will be to the First Circuit Court of Appeal here in Boston. That's likely to take a couple of years in all likelihood before that resolves. And then it's going to be pursued at the Supreme Court of the United States. Lots of lawyers involved, lots of time, lots of money. That's why it becomes so expensive to have to pursue a death penalty case. It's because of the appeals. The cost of incarceration, depending on the facility, might be as little as $35,000, $50,000 a year, but lawyers charge a lot more than that when we talk about
but Evan,
appeals.
you also point out that the cost of incarceration kind of jacks up a little bit too. When someone's fighting the death penalty, they have to be secured in a different way.
That's right. Well, at the very least, they're going to be secured in the most secure conditions in the prison without a chance of being moved into sort of a less expensive area. So yes, they'll get additional guards and there'll be additional protections, and that adds up.
There are many more people on death row in states, and states actually execute more people, but there's still tons of people waiting to be executed in the states that do it, and some of the states that do it the most: Florida, Texas, not California. What's the third
Missouri,
state? Missouri.
Yeah.
Why is it that there's a difference between the feds and the state?
Well, one difference, there's more support, greater support for the death penalty in some of the states, so there are more resources given to pushing people through this process. Having said that, the ratio of people waiting to be executed to people being executed is actually quite similar in the federal system to in many states. It's just that some states have sentenced many more people to die, many more than 74. In California, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people who've been sentenced to death, and they haven't executed anyone in years.
Timothy McVeigh, the last really high-profile person to be executed, and it actually happened rather quickly. So this is the argument against. It's not going to take 10 years. It only took 3 or 4 years.
It took 4 years. But he declined to appeal.
Right.
It was a very unusual situation. He waived his right to appeal. I don't think you can expect that in most cases.
Michael, take us inside the courtroom here because you've been there so much.
Sure.
Timothy McVeigh almost thumbed his nose at the system. There are some who have suggested that Tsarnaev seems like he's having that kind of diffident, I don't care, whatever, put me to death, it might be better for the cause or something like that anyway. So why the strong effort on the part of his defense?
Well, because clearly it appears he does want to live, as much as he may have in the courtroom evinced some attitude that he could care less, and in fact death might be a better alternative for him. He has the right to dictate to his attorneys whether they continue to pursue an appeal, whether they could even continue to pursue opposing the death penalty. He could choose McVeigh's solution and simply say this will be where it ends, whatever happens here. But what we've seen is they've preserved various issues for appeal. Again, that's what's going to have to be reviewed both at the Court of Appeals and ultimately by the Supreme Court. And he appears, at least by the standpoint of his defense strategy and pursuing the defense, is that he would prefer to spend his days in prison as opposed to by way of the death penalty.
Evan, we got part of the answer to my next question, but you've got the rest of it. What happens next? If the jury says, yes, this man needs to be put to death because of the horrendous nature of his crime, we know there'll be appeals, but what happens next if we get to the ultimate moment?
If we get to the ultimate moment, well, we'll all be a lot older, and he won't be executed here in Massachusetts. The most recent federal executions, though they go back over a decade, were in Indiana. There's a facility there, and it's likely, I think, that Tsarnaev would also be executed there. And again, because it's so far out in the future, it's not even clear what method would be used to execute him. There's a lot
Explain.
Well, so currently, the norm is to execute people with lethal injection, right? You use a cocktail of drugs, you make them unconscious, and then use a drug that stops their heart, kills them. But it's become increasingly hard for states to get the right mix of drugs.
And if they get the wrong mix, it would be considered inhumane, and so...
There have been a bunch of botched executions in recent years.
And which state is the one that just decided that they're going to hang people or shoot people?
Utah. Right? Yeah, Utah is talking about
Firing squad.
Right. Some other state is considering nitrogen gas. It's possible that we will have moved on to a new norm by the time, if it should happen, that Tsarnaev is executed.
In terms of, just from a legal standpoint, what we've seen in the trial so far, because the defense kind of pulled back and you know, kind of said, you know what, this guy's guilty, let him be guilty. What is there left in the appeals process that would be the first thing to come up if, in fact, you know, death penalty is...
I actually think one of their strongest arguments with respect to an appeal is the lack of diversity on the jury. I think there was a reordering of the jury pool at the end of the process, and what's happened now, at least when we look at the jury, is we've got a pretty all-white jury that's mostly middle class. That's a typical death penalty jury. The prosecution probably couldn't have asked for a jury, at least stereotypically, that's more likely to bring back a death penalty verdict. And that gives him, it's not that the result, but did the process cause that result? And that gives him a pretty good argument on appeal. That was their last motion that they filed, and I think it's one of their strongest ones.
Before we go, both of you, differing perspectives. What do you think will happen? What do you think this jury will decide?
I don't know what the jury will decide. I will say this. There have been a number of polls that have come out recently showing strong opposition to executing Tsarnaev. Only 3 out of 4 opposed to it in the state. That's surprising, but it's worth remembering that the jury is not a representative sample. The people on the jury were selected based on an increased proclivity to choose the death penalty. So I don't think you can really extrapolate from what you're seeing in the polls to what's going to happen in the trial.
That's a fair comment. I think the jury is likely going to decide which punishment they think is more severe. And I think people are equally torn whether it's the death penalty or the next 60+ years in prison without the benefit of release. I don't think they're going to show mercy. I think they're going to try and figure out what would be the most just punishment in return for the deaths and the maimings that he's caused.
All right, that is Michael Coyne, you recognize here on NECN, and that is Evan Horowitz, who I'm glad you get to know right here on the Broadside. Thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.